Greetings, everyone, and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Keyes. Thank you for listening to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told radio network, where you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, there is the possibility that you're watching me live right now. Now, if you're watching me live right now, that means it is Tuesday, December 13th at about 5:25 p.m., roughly 5:25 p.m. Now, this is the day and time, or the day and roughly the time, I should say, that I record my show every week. So if you do want to try to catch me live, please keep an eye out on my Facebook page. That's God Save the King, Facebook, right? Late Tuesday afternoon. So sometime usually after 4 p.m., somewhere between 4 and 6 p.m. I can't give you a specific time. I don't do it at a specific time every week, but usually sometime between 4 and 6 p.m. on Tuesday afternoon is when I record my weekly show. So if you want to get it fresh and hot off the press, if you want to get it live, this is the time to tune in on my Facebook page. But if not, you can always catch my show. The premiere is always on the Truth Be Told radio network, is always Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, today is December 13th. That means Friday is December 16th, which means on Sunday, this coming Sunday at sundown, is when we begin the Hebrew festival of Hanukah. And we're going to talk extensively about Hanukah today and why it's important. And what I'm really after here today is, if you've listened to my show before, you know the basic premises of God Save the King. God Save the King is almost universally about the nativity. And the reason we talk about the nativity so much is because it's this hyper well-known story. But the challenge is that the story has really taken on a mythological character. It really is Christian mythology. And I don't mean that in a good way. There are times when a story taking on a mythological character can be a good thing, but that's not what I'm talking about right now. Because the whole December 25th myth, because that's what it is, has taught us things about the nativity that are now just indelibly impressed in our minds. We carry around these mind pictures and these thought pictures and these ideas that frankly are not accurate. And what I'm driving at here is that there are times when the fact that the story gets transmitted is more important than being hyper accurate. But the equation becomes, well, what about when the inaccuracies overtake the story? That's when it really becomes a challenge. Like when we did our television show, my co-host, Michael Parker, I think it's the first question out of the gate, where he asks me, well, how do we know that Jesus wasn't born on December 25th? And why is this important? Because I think he even says, because our faith doesn't require it. Well, yeah, actually, yeah, it does. In a way, it does. So on one hand, it's technically not critical exactly when he was born. Was it December 25th? Was it the 24th? Was it the 26th? Or was it September 11th of 3 BC, which is when I believe he was born, and I believe I can demonstrate that to you from Scripture in a reasonable fashion. Now, is it absolute proof? No, of course not. It's not absolute proof, but is it a reasonable theory with a significant amount of evidence that points to that conclusion? Yes. Is December 25th a reasonable theory with a significant amount of evidence that points to that conclusion? No, it's not. Okay, it just isn't. It's not a reasonable theory, and it doesn't have a significant amount of evidence. That all the evidence that we have about December 25th starts about 300 years after Jesus is born. That's not evidence. That's hearsay. That's hearsay. And if you look at the early theories that point to a December 25th birthday, they didn't initially pick a date, right? They picked a concept, see, and then they said, oh, well, this concept, might be right. And the concept is that in ancient times, it was widely believed that the day Jesus died was also the day he was conceived. So that's the hypothesis, that is behind that's behind most of it is that the day Jesus died was also the day he conceived, 33 years apart, right? So therefore they believe he died on March 25th, and that therefore he was conceived on March 25th, and therefore he was born on December 25th. That's the sum and substance of the December 25th theory. It didn't really start. The earliest record we have of somebody suggesting a December 25th birth date is from Hippolytus of Rome right around 210 AD. Now that's 200 years, and 200 years is a long time. It's a long time. And Hippolytus of Rome, by the way, Hippolytus is not Jewish. So this is no longer following a Jewish concept. Actually, the irony is that actually he was. Hippolytus of Rome was actually attempting to go off of a Hebrew tradition. He just wasn't doing a very good job of it. But then within the next 100 years, the leaders of the Western Church were all non-Jews, and they weren't following Jewish practices at all. And as I've said repeatedly, the nativity, okay, because it's intellectually dishonest to call it the first Christmas, because it's not the first Christmas. It's complete. That's very dishonest to do that, because number one, the word Christmas did not exist till about the middle of the 14th century is when the word Christmas started to be used in common usage. It may have existed before then, but it was not in common usage until about the middle of the 14th century, right? Also, you don't have evidence that he was born on the 25th, on December 25th. You don't have that. There isn't any evidence, right? And then to connect the two, December 25th with Christmas, the Mass for Christ, well, this is just all invention. It's not evidence-based. It's invention-based. Okay, so to do this bizarre type of reverse engineering and call the nativity the first Christmas, that's intellectually dishonest. It just doesn't work. So what I want to talk to you about today, however, is nonetheless why this time of year is still important. What does December have to do with anything, right? Because I believe, and like I said, I can take you to Scripture and show you from Scripture why I believe Jesus was born on September 11th of 3 BC, which in the Hebrew calendar was Rosh Hashanah, Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets. Now that is significant, because that's how Jewish thinking worked. In Jewish thinking, prophecy was not just prediction. Prophecy was a model. It was an example. The fancy theological word would be a type, right? So you had a type in the Old Testament, and then you had the antitype, or the fulfillment of the type, usually fulfilled in the person of Christ. So while we aren't given a specific typology that said Jesus would be born on the Feast of Trumpets, nonetheless, when you note that he very likely was born on that date, then it becomes extremely provocative. Because is that a coincidence, or does God do things deliberately to try to present us with a message and a riddle that then we can decipher and go, oh, look at that. That's really interesting. That's really provocative, because what that means is if Jesus was born on September 3rd of 3 BC, if he was born on Rosh Hashanah at about 6:45, 7 o'clock p.m. as the sun is going down, that means that at exactly the same time that he was being born, about 6 miles to the north in the temple in Jerusalem, shofars were being blown announcing his birth, whether they realized it or not. And you see, Rosh Hashanah, as I've talked about in other episodes, is the date that the Jews believe, according to their tradition. You won't find it in the Bible. You'll find it in the extra biblical traditions. And I'm admitting that right up front, but this is a powerful Jewish tradition, and Jesus was Jewish. Jesus wasn't a Christian. Joseph and Mary weren't Christians. They were Jews. Okay, so the Nativity is not a Christian story. It's a Jewish story. So according to Jewish tradition, Rosh Hashanah, the first day of Tishri, is the day that God created humanity. It's the day that he created Adam and Eve, and that when he created Adam, that Adam's first words out of his mouth were, "The Lord God is king of the universe." So this became the day that the Jews traditionally recognize the regnal reign, the regnal reign of their kings. That's from the Department of Redundancy department right there. The reign of their kings, right? The regnal year always began on Tishri 1. So do you think that's a coincidence that the astronomical sign of Revelation 12:1 tells us that Jesus was likely born on the first day of Tishri? Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think that's a coincidence. But why is December important? Because December still is important to the nativity story and for other reasons, because it does factor into the nativity. It's just not the day that he was born. So how does it factor in? Well, we're going to talk about this today and next week and probably the week after that. So I really encourage you to tune in on those days to hear the continuation of what we're going to talk about today, because we're going to look at the timeline of the nativity. We're going to start with when Joseph and Mary were betrothed. They were most likely betrothed in the spring of 4 BC. And then we're going to follow that timeline through until we get to the arrival of the Magi, and then their departure into Egypt, and then Herod's death, and then their return from Egypt. We're going to do that whole timeline. Okay. And I want to try to do that next week. Also, as I mentioned at the outset of this episode, we're going to talk about Hanukah. And Hanukah plays a role in our story in a variety of ways. Number one, the historical events of the feast, the reason that we have the festival of Hanukah is part of the history of Israel and of Judea in the middle of the 2nd century BC. And frankly, this story, this historical background, and when I say historical background, I mean everything. I mean the history, the politics, the religion, the social structure, everything that was going on in the nation of Israel at that time in the middle of the 2nd century BC is what sets the stage for the nativity. So that's what we're going to be talking about here in just a minute. Okay. So once again, why is December important? Okay, well, the festival of Hanukkah occurs in December, right? I believe Jesus may have been conceived during Hanukkah. Now, can we prove that? No. Is it a valid theory? Yes. It's a very valid theory, because if you just look at the timing of things, it makes sense that he would be born during the Festival of Lights, during that he would, see, I just slipped, that he would be conceived during the Festival of Lights, during the Feast of Dedication, the dedication of the temple. And what was Jesus if not the temple of God, the fullness of the Godhead bodily, the Son of God incarnate and coming into the world? See, so once again, following our prophecy is not just prediction, but prophecy is pattern, model. See, then this would make sense that he would have been conceived during the Feast of Dedication. Also, during his adult life, he kept the Feast of Hanukkah. The Gospel of John records that Jesus was in the temple during the Feast of Hanukkah. Very interesting. Also, we're going to show you, I want to do this on the 23rd, Friday night, the 23rd, when we release that episode. I want to talk about, actually, that's the 23rd is going to be the timeline of the nativity. Okay, because that makes sense. I'm going to try to release that one as close to December 25th as possible, is to talk about the timeline of the nativity. In other words, I'm going to tell the story the way it really would have looked, as best as possible, throwing in dates and times and things like that, so you can get the picture of what happened. Then on December 30th, okay, even though that's quote unquote after Christmas, and a lot of people are going to not pay attention because it's quote unquote after Christmas, we're going to talk about the arrival of the Magi, because the arrival of the Magi can be documented as occurring in late December of 2 BC. Okay, and I'm going to show you why. So that's what we're going to talk about on Friday night, the 30th, is we're going to talk about the stations of Jupiter. The stations of Jupiter is how we can verify that the Magi arrived in Judea in late December of 2 BC, shortly before Herod died. So let's talk about Hanukah, right? Because Hanukah and the historical background of Hanukah, okay, is super important when it comes to the nativity. It's extremely important because, like I said a moment ago, it sets the historical background. And what I'm going to try to do here in the time that we have remaining, we got about 39 minutes, 38 minutes to go here, is I want to give you a brief history primarily of what leads up to Hanukah, but then tell you why I'm giving you this brief history, because when you see the paradigm, the historical, religious, political, and social paradigm that gets created because of what happens historically, this helps us understand why it is so significant that Jesus was born when he was and how it fits into this paradigm. Okay, so some of this is kind of review, but if you haven't heard my show before and you haven't heard this material before, this is important. This is really important stuff. So what we're going to do is we're going to back all the way up, and we're going to start about 1,000 years before Jesus, and we're going to talk just for a couple of minutes about the United Kingdom. And by the United Kingdom, I mean the kingdom of Israel under Saul, and then David and Solomon, the first three kings of the nation of Israel. Because under the first three kings, Saul, David, and Solomon, the Hebrew nation was united. And this unity was not artificial, it was genuine, but it also relied very heavily upon the strength and leadership of these three Hebrew kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. And that's because each of these men, even though they were not necessarily exemplary, wow, tripping over my tongue today, exemplary leaders at certain times. You know, each one of them was very human and had very human failings at certain times. Nonetheless, each of these was a very strong, capable leader, and it was their leadership that kept the nation unified. Saul, David, and Solomon. And during their reign, primarily because of David's military conquests, the nation of Israel was at its political and geophysical peak. And then by the end of Solomon's reign, the nation of Israel had defeated their enemies, built the temple, and developed a flourishing economy and become the center of the civilized world, and they had achieved peace and unity. Israel had reached the pinnacle of its strength and its influence. Now, the only problem with this is that when you reach the top like this, oftentimes the only way to go is down, right? So now the next point in Israel's history is what we have to talk about next, which is what is called the divided kingdom. So you got to fast forward a bit here, and you get to Solomon's son, Rehoboam, right? Now, when Solomon died, Rehoboam assumed the throne. He was young, inexperienced, arrogant, and worst of all, prone to following bad advice. Now, Rehoboam's nemesis was a young leader named Jeroboam. Now, according to the Talmud, Jeroboam was extraordinarily gifted. He was a superior person with an abundance of charisma, as well as being a great organizer and, above all, a magnificent scholar. Now, if Rehoboam had genuinely sought the best interests of the people, and even Jeroboam himself might likely have united behind him. But in one of the most colossal blunders of all time, Rehoboam ignored the advice of older, wiser men because he inherited his father's advisors, who he promptly ignored. Really bad move. Like I said, one of the most colossal blunders of all human history is he ignored the advice of the older, wiser men, the older, wiser counselors, and he took the advice of his younger, less experienced counselors who told him to deal very harshly with the people. And that was a really, really bad move. So realizing that Rehoboam was not listening to them or even even his father's own advisors, 10 of the 12 tribes declared independence and made Jeroboam their king, and they formed the northern kingdom that became known as the kingdom of Israel. So only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin remained loyal to the house of David, and they became the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. So you've got the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, then you've got the southern kingdom of Judah. The capital of Judah remained Jerusalem, while the capital of the northern kingdom was established at Samaria. And that is part of why, not all, but part of why Samaria has the reputation it does, is because it became the capital of the northern kingdom. Now, the reason this is important, right? This is not just history for history's sake. This is actually important. It's important to Hanukah, which we're going to get to in a minute, and it's important to the nativity, which is why we're talking about it. Because the critical fact here is that according to the Torah commanded all able-bodied males to engage in 3 pilgrimage festivals every year. In other words, they had to travel to Jerusalem. So now if you are a devout Jew, but you live in the northern kingdom, this is a real problem, because Jeroboam knew that if he allowed this, that if he allowed the people to travel to Jerusalem, that their hearts would turn back, quote unquote, to Rehoboam. So consequently, he made the fateful decision to forbid the citizens of the northern kingdom to travel to Jerusalem, and he set up alternative methods of idolatrous worship in the northern kingdom. Bad move, and all subsequent monarchs of the northern kingdom followed his lead. That is critical. So he set up idolatrous worship in the northern kingdom, and all subsequent monarchs of the northern kingdom followed him. So what you've got here is you're setting up a paradigm between the devout and the apostates. There you go. You've got the devout in the southern kingdom, and then you've got the apostates in the northern kingdom. And as I've said, the northern kingdom was apostate, and the northern kingdom was apostate for its entire existence. That never changed, right? Now, that doesn't mean there might not have been individuals, of course, or even communities that might have been devout, but the northern kingdom is our example in the scripture of what happens when people go apostate en masse, and when their leaders go apostate and set up idolatrous alternative forms of worship. Now, in the southern kingdom, however, good and bad kings were cyclical. Sometimes they'd have a good king, sometimes they'd have a bad king. Every other generation or so, a great king would step forward and strengthen the faith of the people. So that's really interesting, because that never happened in the northern kingdom, right? The northern kingdom followed the mold of Jeroboam for about 200 years, right? Now, what this means also, in addition to the whole devout versus apostate thing, is that the Hebrew kingdom is no longer united geographically, culturally, and to an increasing degree, ethnically. Okay, because the northern kingdom especially is going to start allowing intermarriage with foreign nations. And it's only going to get worse over time. So in the southern kingdom, as much as they could, they tried to maintain their devotion, and they remembered the prophecies of the coming one. See, and they're thinking in their head, oh, remember, it wasn't all that long ago. It was not all that long ago that we had the United Kingdom under Saul and David in particular, right? You always look at David as the model, because we're told that the Messiah will be from the line, the house of David. They don't mention Saul, because for one thing, Saul was a Benjaminite. So, and there's a really interesting backstory behind that, why Saul was from Benjamin and not from Judah. But David and Solomon were both from the tribe of Judah, right? And we were told very plainly that the Messiah will be from the tribe of Judah and from the house of David. So the southern kingdom is still looking backwards and going, wow, it really wasn't all that long ago that David ruled in Israel, and that was the peak of our power. And the Messiah is coming eventually. It might be tomorrow, it might be next week, it might be next year, that we will get a Davidic king back on the throne of Israel. But things just keep going from bad to worse, because the next big thing that comes on the timeline is the foreign captivity of the northern kingdom, because the big gorilla on the block, so to speak, is an empire to the north and east of Israel called Assyria. They're a northern Mesopotamian empire, and they have been dominant in the region actually for quite a while already. But by the time we get to the late 8th century BC is when the Assyrian Empire captures the northern kingdom. They come through, they attack Samaria, they frankly burn it to the ground, and they take an enormous portion of the northern kingdom captive to Assyria. And then their foreign policy was that then they would import in foreigners. So they take a big chunk of the ethnic population out, and then they move in foreign ethnicities into their place, right? So what this does is you can't help but the population starts to intermingle and intermarry. And then what that does is that starts to dilute the ethnic identity of the populace, and therefore they don't want to rebel as much, right? They still want to rebel, but not as much. So that's what happens first, is that the northern kingdom goes into captivity to the Assyrian Empire. Now it takes about takes about 100 years, but the Assyrian Empire begins to rapidly decline. And about 100 years later, the new big gorilla on the block is now the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Empire, now they're a southern Mesopotamian empire. They attack to the northwest. They go after Assyria. They conquer the Assyrians. They also defeat the Egyptians and things like that. And so Assyria falls to Babylon in roughly 605, 604 BC. That's when you have the famous battle of Carchemish and Nebuchadnezzar, who is the general of the Babylonian army at that time. He's not king yet. He defeats Pharaoh Necho at the Battle of Carchemish, and Pharaoh Necho was a pharaoh of Egypt who had come to the aid of the failing Assyrian Empire, right? So that's in the very late 7th century BC. Now, what happens then is that Nebuchadnezzar decides to dip down, and he conquers the southern kingdom of Judah as well and takes them captive. So now both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, they technically don't really exist in a manner of speaking. They're gone. So, and again, big portions of the population get taken captive back to Babylon. And not only that, but the Babylonians, they inherit the Jewish captives of the Assyrians, because there is now a large Jewish population outside the Promised Land. And that's important. That's another key thing to understand here in why is this important, is because now you have a large Jewish population outside the Promised Land. And they are intermixing and intermarrying with foreigners outside the Promised Land, although some of them are trying to remain devout and trying to remain, to only marry other Jews and within the tribe and things like that. So once again, here you go again, you've got this interesting paradigm of the devout versus the apostates. The devout versus the apostates, right? And then now you've got those that remain in the land, which at this point is a tiny remnant that is actually back in Israel, and the majority of them have been transported outside, transported outside of the Promised Land. So Assyria captures the northern kingdom. Babylon conquers the southern kingdom. Babylon defeats Assyria. Babylon is now the new superpower, right? And you have this large Jewish population in the city of Babylon and then in the region of Babylonia in general, outside of the Promised Land. So now if we jump forward in history, the next big thing on the timeline is that the Persian Empire conquers Babylon. Persia conquers Babylon. Now, when this happens, one of the key components in the story is the fact that Cyrus the Great, the king of Persia, he decides to let the majority, he offers, I should say, it's the better way to say it, he offers to let the Jews return home to rebuild their temple. But in a very interesting twist here, the majority of them decide not to. He makes the offer. He says, you're free to leave as long as you remain loyal to the Persian Empire and pay your taxes, pay your tribute and things like that. I'll let you go home and rebuild your temple and pretty much live your lives unmolested. You just got to pay your tribute. You're a tributary nation. You don't belong to yourself. You're not independent. You don't get to completely do as you want, but we'll let you self-govern if you will just remember who you belong to and pay your tribute, right? But in this very interesting twist, the majority of the Jews don't go home. The majority of them remain in Babylon. Really interesting. Only about 40,000, which we estimate as being really only like less than 5%. Like less than 5% remain that actually travel back to Israel, the Promised Land, Canaan, with Zerubbabel and Joshua, right? So the next big thing, the next big tick on the timeline is that then the Persian Empire falls to the Greek Empire. And this is right around 333, 332, 331 BC is when Alexander the Great, he wins 3 major successive battles against the Persians, which precipitates the fall of the Persian Empire. And Alexander basically takes over the known world right around 331, 330 BC. Okay. Now, he moves his capital to Babylon, of course, right? He moves his capital to Babylon and he starts ruling from Babylon. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't last very long. He only rules for about 7 years and then he dies. So he died at like 33 years old, very young, which means, he ascended, he reached his pinnacle at like 26 years old. And then 7 years later, he's dead. And he died without a viable heir. That was always a big question in his court with his liaisons and things like that was, could he produce an heir? And he died without a viable heir. So the result of this is that his strongest generals very quickly laid claim to various portions of his empire. Now, this is significantly oversimplified, but you had this thing called the Wars of the Diadochi, which simply means his successors, the Wars of the Diadochi. And then it took about 20 years, really. It took about 20 years for it to finally get settled. But after the Battle of Ipsus in 301, the empire was basically divided into 4 portions. So you had Cassander, who was in control of Macedonia. You had Lysimachus, who controlled Thrace and a portion of Asia Minor. Then you had the general Seleucus, who controlled the remainder of Asia Minor, Syria, Mesopotamia, and all of the eastern provinces. And then you had the general Ptolemy, who took Egypt. Now, this is the reason this is important, is because you've got Ptolemy, who's in control of Egypt. You've got Seleucus, who is in charge of Syria and Mesopotamia and the East. And then you've got this little geographic area called Israel that is sandwiched between Ptolemy and Seleucus, right? So who controls Judea? Who controls Israel? Well, initially it's the Ptolemies from Egypt. They're the ones that quickly move into Judea and take control. And they managed to take control of Judea for, at this, because you're at roughly 300 BC when the lines are drawn, right? So it lasts about 100 years. There are several, I think it's 5, significant wars between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids over the next 100 years. So finally, at that point, it shifts. It goes back and forth, but then it finally shifts that the Seleucids, they come to dominate Judea, the kingdom of Judea. Now, here we go again. So why is this important? Because these are both Greek empires, right? It's not Alexander the Great anymore. It's 2 of his generals. The other 2, Cassander and Lysimachus, they're not really in the picture. Only Ptolemy and Seleucus are really relevant to our story, but they are nonetheless Greek. Okay? They're Greek. And a big part of what's going on here, like I said, is that you've got a large Jewish population outside the promised land, but now because of the return, you've got a large Jewish population back in the land again, but now they are under foreign dominion who is putting them under their thumb. So one of Alexander's very important concepts that he believed in was a concept that we know today called Hellenism. And Hellenism was the effort to make the world Greek. Alexander wanted it desperately, and also his successors also pushed it very, very heavily, was that wherever they ruled, there had to be Greek language, Greek religion, and then Greek social structure, and everything like that. So what we have here is, how did Hellenism influence, interestingly enough, because now the equation gets a little more complicated, because you've got the Seleucids clearly rule the Jews that are outside the promised land, but now they're also ruling the Jews that are inside the promised land. And the ones that are inside the promised land, they're the ones that went back, at least supposedly, because they were more devout, whereas the ones that remained outside were the more apostate, the more progressive, the more liberal, right? But the ones who went back, they're more conservative, they're more devout, they're trying to maintain their religion, they're trying to be loyal to God's commandments in the Torah, and then the writings, the Psalms, the prophecies, everything about the Davidic king that would eventually come. So how the Seleucids and how the Ptolemies treated the Jews in their empires is really significant, because the Ptolemies, although the Jews were definitely under their thumb, make no mistake about it, the Ptolemies were a little more, we'll use the word again, they were a little more progressive. They were a little more tolerant of the Jews within their empire. As a matter of fact, in the Egyptian city of Alexandria, you now had a very prosperous Jewish community popping up there. So you not only had a huge Jewish community in Babylon, you now had a big Jewish community in Alexandria, both under Greek rule. And the one in Alexandria was significantly more enlightened than the one in Babylon. The one in Babylon was treated a little more harshly by their overlords. But then most especially, what's really critical here, okay, is how the Jews were treated in the promised land. How they were treated in the promised land, because you had a succession of Seleucid rulers that really wanted to put the Jews under their thumb. And now, once again, you've got this paradigm between the Jews that are devout and then the Jews that are apostate. Or in other words, the Jews that wanted to remain true and loyal to their Jewish roots and the keeping of the Torah and a Davidic king, and then the Jews that embraced Hellenism. There were Jews that embraced Hellenism, that they made friends with their Greek overlords, and they started adopting Greek ways. They started speaking Greek. They started taking Greek names. They started worshiping Greek gods to certain degrees, or at least tolerating it when they weren't, quote unquote, supposed to tolerate it, right? So this creates really significant, political conflict between Hellenizing and devout Jews in Judea. There's the key, in Judea under Syrian dominion. So let me say that again. You now have a very, very serious conflict between devout Jews and Hellenizing Jews in the Promised Land under Syrian dominion, under Seleucid dominion, okay, which means the Syrian Greeks, okay, different words that all kind of mean the same thing there. So you've had a succession of Seleucid kings, and by the time you get to the early portion of the 2nd century BC, and I mean portion, so like about 175-ish BC, you've got a Seleucid king known as Antiochus IV. And Antiochus IV, who was also called Epiphanes, and Epiphany means, in Greek, means God made manifest, right? So he's calling himself Antiochus, God made manifest, right? So he is as arrogant as it gets. He thinks he is God on earth, right? He was an extreme Hellenizer. He was also a religious bigot and an ethnic bigot. He despised the Jews. He hated the Jews, okay? So this conflict, right, between the devout Jews and the Hellenizing Jews, it threw him into an absolute rage. So he precipitated a pogrom against the Jews, right? And this was way worse than what Nebuchadnezzar had ever done, which is weird because Nebuchadnezzar burned the temple, right? Well, no, this is way worse because as special as the temple was a physical representation of God. And even the Jews knew that. Even though it was their sacred space, even the Jews knew that the temple is a physical thing, right? And even though Nebuchadnezzar burned it to the ground, what Antiochus was doing was way worse because he didn't burn it to the ground. Because the new one, is being built, right? There's a new one being built right now because remember when Cyrus the Great, the Persian, sent the Jews back to the Promised Land to rebuild their temple, which they did. Well, now this is another empire down the line. The Greeks have conquered the Persians, right? And the Jews are under Greek dominion, but now they've got a temple again. Now it's nothing like Solomon's temple, that it pales in comparison, but they've got a temple and they've restored their worship. They've got a high priest again. They've got a priesthood again. The daily sacrifice is happening again. So the Jews love this. They're doing everything they can to be devout as possible. But Antiochus despises the Jews with every fiber of his being. So what he does is he makes it basically illegal to be a Jew. That's really kind of what it boils down to, is he makes everything they do illegal, and the penalty for any of it pretty much is death, right? So he forbade temple sacrifices and offerings on pain of death. He forbade circumcision on pain of death. He forbade the observance of the Sabbath and all festivals, pain of death. And he forbade the reading or even the ownership of Torah. So in other words, he said, okay, yeah, you guys can keep your religion. You just can't do any of it, right? I mean, I can't stop what you're thinking in your head, but I can stop what you're doing with your hands, and you don't get to do any of it, right? So by doing this, he's desecrating their religion, which to the Jewish manner of thinking is way worse than simply burning the temple to the ground. He's defiling it. He's making it dirty. He's making it evil. He's corrupting it. He's defiling it. He's making it impure. He's saying, oh yeah, you can keep it, but you can't do it right, right? So Finally, he loots the temple, right? He steals from the temple. He takes the golden altar of incense. He takes the golden lampstand. He takes the table of showbread. He takes the veil, and then all the other accessories, the accoutrements, the sacred cups, the bowls, the censers, all that stuff. He takes all that. He strips all the gold plating off the temple, right? And he even stole what are known as the secret treasures, because the temple did also serve as a bank, in a manner of speaking. So private money was kept there as well. So he took all those. And then, so finally, to top it off, the Syrian Greeks, the Seleucid Greeks, they built altars within the temple precincts. They profaned the Sabbath, defiled the sanctuary, and offered unclean animals for sacrifice on these altars within the temple precincts, right? So now the crowning insult comes on the 25th of Kislev in 167 BC. So this is how we get to Hanukah, right? This is it. This is the origin of Hanukah right here. So the crowning insult comes on the 25th of Kislev in 167 BC. Antiochus erected an idol of Zeus in the temple and compelled the Jews to offer sacrifice to Zeus, right, and himself in the form of, pigs, swine, and other unclean animals, and then forced them to eat the entrails of the unclean animals, and then to witness the Greeks' drunken revelry and sex orgies and everything else that they were doing within the temple precincts. Well, word also got out to within, 8, 10, 12 miles of Jerusalem, and there's a little town northwest of Jerusalem called Modin, and the word got out there that the local sacrifice that was going to go on there, that had to be offered, had to be a pig, had to be an unclean offering. And there was an elderly priest there whose name was Matthias, and he lived there with his 5 sons in the village of Modin. And according to Josephus, what happened is that a Syrian official, a Greek official, right, attempted to force Matthias to perform this unclean sacrifice. Well, Matthias turned on him, kills him, and then also kills a collaborating Jew who was there to help offer the sacrifice, right? Well, Matthias and his family, they fled into the wilderness and were soon joined by thousands of faithful Jews in a full-blown revolt against Syrian rule. All right, so here it is. You now have a full-blown rebellion, a full-blown revolution by the Jews against the Syrian Greeks, the Seleucids. Now, one thing I forgot to mention that is important here is that the Seleucid Empire was so large when Seleucus inherited it from Alexander, it was enormous. And almost immediately, he could not control the entire thing. He actually controlled portions east of the Indus River in India, and they broke away like right away, right? He went to war with that empire very, very quickly and then broke away. He gave up that very early. In about 250 BC, roughly 250 BC is when the Parthians broke loose, because that's part of our story here, is this little satrapy on the southeast corner of the Caspian Sea called Parthia. They broke free and got their independence. And then what is going on here is the Seleucid Empire, they're slowly declining because they just cannot control this extraordinarily huge piece of land that was left to them by Alexander. So now they have diminished in power so much that even the Jews have enough power to overthrow the Seleucids. And that's exactly what happens. So Matthias starts this rebellion, and then his sons take over, because Matthias did die, and 3 of his sons continued leading the revolt. The first one is the one who is the most well-known. He's known as Judas Maccabee, or Judah Maccabee, and Maccabee is known is roughly, it's widely recognized as meaning the hammer. It's challenged by some, but there you have it, that he was called Judah the Hammer, right? And then the Maccabees, therefore, that is a phrase that is technically used to refer to Matthias and Matthias's sons who ruled after him, which would have been Judah, Jonathan, and Simon. But they also had a family name that goes back to their grandfather, whose name was Asmon or Asmoneus, right? See, and there it is. That's a Greek name, like we were talking about. Now, they had Jewish names too, don't get me wrong, but the fact that there are Greek names prevalent in this helps contribute to this picture of how much how much the Greeks wanted to Hellenize the Jews, make them take Greek names, make them use Greek names, see? So once you get past Matthias and his sons, then their sons, okay, they begin to be known as the Hasmoneans, right? But they threw off Seleucid rule. And then what they did is that when they finally managed to throw off Seleucid rule, one of the first things they did is that they cleansed and then rededicated the temple. And this is everything we're doing today has all been about the origin of Hanukkah. I'm not really getting into the practices, which are interesting, but the point being here is that they cleansed. Okay, so they ritually cleansed. I don't just mean scrub it down with soap and water, although they did that too, but I mean they ritually cleansed the temple from its defilement from these foreign practices and thereby, quote unquote, the foreign gods, right? So they ritually cleansed and then rededicated the temple. And that dedication is now has been commemorated ever since. So the commemoration of the dedication or the rededication of the temple is known as Hanukkah. That's what Hanukkah is. And it takes place in and around the 25th of Kislev every year. Now, the Jewish calendar, remember, is a lunar calendar, so it doesn't fall on the same day every year. It generally falls in December. Sometimes not. Sometimes it varies a little bit, can spill over into January sometimes. But generally speaking, it falls in December because Kislev, generally speaking, falls in December. So it takes place, I think it starts on the 25th of Kislev and then goes for 8 days after that. And they've got particular practices of the lighting of the Hanukah, right? Now, the Hanukah is not a menorah. The Hanukah is a 9-branched lampstand. The menorah is a 7-branched lampstand. And the lighting of the Hanukah is very important because that commemorates the relighting of the menorah, ironically, of the menorah in the temple during the time of the Maccabean revolt and the rededication of the temple. And then there's this tradition that may or may not have actually started at that time. It may have developed later, that when they relit the menorah, that they only had, I think it was 1 day's worth of oil for the lampstand, and that the oil miraculously did not run out. Okay, now, so we are about to wrap up here. So let me summarize and get to this really significant point, because this is what tells the tale of the Maccabean revolt. It's what tells the tale of Hanukkah, and it's what tells the tale and sets the context of God Save the King. That's why this is important, and that is why the month of December remains important to our story, is this contrast, once again, between the devout and the apostates. The devout and the apostates, because the challenge was not nearly so much the foreigners, right? Because the foreigners that tried to control Judea, well, that's obvious. They're foreigners. Okay. If you're a Jew, then you just simply, you don't like them and you don't want to obey, and you're going to try really hard not to do what they say and things like that. But the problem was that they had Hellenizers within Judaism itself. You had Hellenizers within Judaism itself, and they wanted to, therefore, corrupt the Jewish system. That's the problem, right? They wanted to corrupt the Jewish system. So Hellenizing Jews were not looked upon by their more conservative compatriots as simply being guilty of garden variety sin. In other words, any one of a variety of minor infractions that would render a Jew ceremonially unclean or something like that. They looked upon Hellenizing Jews as traitors. That's the point. They looked upon Hellenizing Jews as traitors, as those betraying the faith of their people, betraying their way of life, and frankly, giving aid and comfort to the enemy. So now you have this group of leaders called the Hasmoneans, but what's going to happen over time is that the Hasmoneans are going to become more and more Hellenized themselves. And that is what sets the context for Herod the Great becoming the Roman appointed king of Judea, and then the actual bringing of the Son of God into the world at the birth of Jesus Christ, the incarnation of the Son of God. It takes place in this really interesting political environment where you have all of these apostates in and around Jerusalem and the temple and things like that. And yet God secretly brings his son into the world in this little backwater town about 6 miles from Jerusalem. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have gone over here. I hope they don't cut this off on the network. I've gone over time. My name is Tim Keyes. I am the host of God Save the King. I want to thank you for joining me every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. God Save the King.